Eliza gripped her apron as tightly as she could, knuckles white against the chill, while Lady Hargrave's voice sliced through the corridor like a blade. "You've brought shame to this house, girl. You are to leave at once." Eliza didn't speak. Her throat burned with words that would never be allowed to rise. She'd only ever obeyed, served quietly, done every chore before it was asked. And yet, the minute her growing belly showed beneath her maid's uniform, the entire manor turned its back. The whispers had started days ago, the side glances from other staff, the sudden silence when she entered a room. But this exile without a chance to explain, was crueler than anything she'd imagined. "It was your son," she had wanted to scream, but she knew it would make no difference. Lord Hargrave would never claim her, not when his legacy depended on a clean name and a polished air. Eliza stumbled down the gravel path leading from the back of the manor, clutching a satchel with 2 worn dresses and a knitted bonnet she hadn't yet dared to imagine her child wearing. The trees beyond the estate gate swayed like ghosts in the wind, the village far beyond them silent and unfamiliar. She hadn't a penny nor a family to turn to, just the weight of her unborn child pressing against her ribs and the ache of betrayal turning her bones to stone. Rain began to fall, not in sheets, but in a slow, cruel drizzle that soaked her thin cloak and stuck her hair to her cheeks. With every step down the muddy lane, she whispered the same thing to herself. "You'll survive. You must," but with no hearth, no shelter, and a future erased by a nobleman's sin, her hope hung by a thread. When she finally reached the edge of the village and saw the flickering candle in a window across the green, she almost turned away, until she saw the figure inside. A man, older, wrapped in shawls and herbs, standing by a mortar. He looked up suddenly, as if sensing her. Their eyes met through the glass. And though she didn't know it then, Eliza had just found the only soul who might see more than shame in her presence. Eliza stood frozen in the rain, unsure whether the man's gaze was an invitation or a warning, but her legs, aching and near collapse, made the decision for her. She stepped through the village gate, crossing the slick grass toward the crooked stone cottage that sat apart from the rest, half hidden beneath an overgrown willow and thick ivy that curled like a shield around its edges. Before she could lift her hand to knock, the door creaked open. "Get in," the man said, his voice low and certain, as if this moment had already happened before. She hesitated only a second and then crossed the threshold, the warmth of the fire hitting her like a wave. "Sit," he said, pointing to a stool by the hearth. "You're cold to the bone, and the child inside you is shivering worse than you are." His words stunned her. He hadn't asked her name. He hadn't scolded her. He hadn't even looked at her belly with the judgment she'd grown used to. "I don't have anything to give you," she said softly, trembling hands near the fire. "No money, no story you'd want to hear." He raised an eyebrow and crushed something between his fingers, lavender perhaps, and dropped it into a boiling kettle. "I don't collect stories for profit," he said. "I mend what the world tosses aside." His name was Thorn, and his cottage smelled of roots, iron, and old books. On the walls were bundles of herbs, dried wildflowers, and strange symbols carved into wood. She watched him move, not like a nobleman or even a village tradesman, but like someone who understood what it meant to survive with nothing but skill and silence. When he finally handed her the steaming mug, his hands brushed hers for a second, and she flinched, not in fear but from the unfamiliar comfort of touch, without demand. "You can sleep by the fire tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, we talk." And with that, he turned away, leaving her to sip something bitter and warm while trying not to cry. She didn't trust it, this quiet, this safety, this man who asked nothing and offered shelter, but she curled up on the woven mat anyway, and for the first time in weeks, she slept. Not because she believed she was safe, but because, for the first time, someone had let her be human. When Eliza woke, The fire had gone down to embers, and the scent of ash and thyme lingered in the air like a memory. Thorn was already moving about the kitchen, chopping something with swift, precise strokes. She sat up slowly, the weight of her body reminding her of everything she'd tried to forget. "How long can I stay?" she asked, her voice raw. Thorn didn't answer right away. He poured hot water over dried leaves in 2 chipped cups and finally said, "Long enough to remember that you're not ruined." The words hit harder than any insult ever had. "You don't even know what I did," she whispered, folding her arms across her belly. "I was cast out, banished. They said I brought shame." Thorn looked at her, really looked, and then handed her a cup. "You were used," he said, "then blamed. That's not shame, that's survival." His voice wasn't soft, but it was clean, like cold spring water on a dirty face. "You're not the first they've thrown away, and if I have any say in it, you won't be the last to return stronger." Eliza didn't know what to do with his certainty. It felt like being handed a sword when all you'd known were chains. She stared into the tea, letting the heat rise into her face. "I don't even know how to begin again." Thorn leaned back in his chair. "You start by eating. Then we get herbs to keep that child strong. Then, if you're willing, you help me gather and prepare the healing stock for winter. There's coin in it, and reputation too. This village may not have welcomed you, but once you're needed, they'll look at you different." It was too much, too fast, too kind, and yet Eliza found herself nodding. She followed him that day through forest paths and muddy hills, her skirts heavy, but her steps steadier than they'd been in weeks. He taught her how to identify roots by scent and bark by feel. He didn't ask about the father, he didn't ask why she hadn't fought back. He only handed her a basket and said, "Don't pick anything unless it looks like it wants to be picked." And somehow, in the middle of damp leaves and dying light, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she still had worth beyond the pain they gave her. By the 3rd week, the village began to notice her, not as the maid cast out of the manor, but as the quiet girl who carried herbs and walked beside the healer. Eliza kept her head down, but she felt their stares ripple through the marketplace like chill wind through linen. The butcher's wife muttered something sharp beneath her breath. A cluster of older women near the well clutched their shawls tighter when she passed, and yet no one dared confront her. Not since Thorn began sending her to deliver remedies, not since his respect began to cling to her like a borrowed cloak. "They talk because they don't understand," Thorn said one evening as she sorted dried chamomile into pouches. "Let them talk. It means they've noticed you've returned alive." She wanted to believe him, but inside, every glance still felt like judgment. Every whisper still burned like truth. What they didn't know, what even Thorn hadn't asked, was that she had begged Lord Hargrave not to let her go. That she'd dropped to her knees, hands on her belly, pleading for a scrap of mercy. "You're nothing but a servant," he'd said, adjusting his cuffs like her tears stained his silk. "The child means nothing to me." And so she carried not just shame, but silence. At night she dreamed of that moment, of his cold eyes, of the lady's smug satisfaction, of the way the door slammed and erased her existence. But in the daylight she pressed forward. She mixed herbs, she wrapped joints, she helped bring down fevers. And slowly she saw how people softened, not because they liked her, but because she was useful. Mrs. Penrose, the widow with the failing joints, handed her a loaf of brown bread. The blacksmith nodded when she passed. Even the baker's young apprentice smiled once, awkwardly but not unkind. Thorn noticed. "They'll come around," he said. "Villages change slower than seasons, but they change." Eliza didn't answer. She was still learning how to accept kindness that wasn't transactional. But one afternoon, a boy barely old enough to speak tugged her apron and handed her a flower, half crushed, plucked from a patch of weeds, and whispered, For the baby. Eliza looked down, her breath caught, and for the first time since her exile, her hand instinctively rose to her belly. She didn't feel shame. She felt something far more dangerous. She felt hope. Eliza was gathering rosemary outside Thorne's cottage when the carriage appeared, its wheels crackling across the gravel like distant thunder. She straightened, heart skipping, as the familiar crest gleamed on the lacquered door. Hargrave Manor. Before she could retreat, the carriage door opened, and Lady Hargrave stepped out in a gown the colour of a bruised sky. Her gloved hands folded, her eyes cold as slate. "So it's true," she said, lips curling as she took in Eliza's rounded form and mud-splattered hem. "You've found yourself a witch doctor and a ditch to rot in." Eliza said nothing, gripping her basket with trembling fingers. Thorne emerged behind her, silent and unreadable, but present like a shadow that refused to move. "What do you want?" Eliza asked, the wind catching her hair and pushing it into her eyes. "My husband's reputation is at risk," Lady Hargrave said smoothly. "People talk. They always do. I need you gone, out of this village, out of our memory. There will be coin if you take it." She pulled a purse from her cloak and dropped it onto the earth between them, as if it were filth she didn't want to touch. Eliza stared at it. Enough silver to buy passage, to start over, to disappear. And yet, she didn't move. "You already erased me once," she said quietly, "but I'm still here, and now people know my name for something other than shame." Lady Hargrave's face flickered, a fracture in her mask. "You think you've built something," she hissed. "This little hut and a few sick villagers' gratitude. That child is a curse, and one day you'll know it." Eliza took a step forward, her voice steady. "Then let me carry it. I'd rather raise a child born of sin in truth than live in a house built on lies." The silence that followed felt thick enough to choke on. Thorne didn't speak, but he moved to stand beside her. And together, they watched the woman retreat, the carriage door slamming shut like the final page of a book. When the wheels turned and the manor crest vanished down the road, Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She didn't pick up the coin. She didn't need to. Her spine had straightened. Her voice had returned. And her place, however fragile, was hers now. The storm rolled in just after midnight, thunder cracking like cannon fire over the village rooftops, and Eliza jolted upright, clutching her belly as pain lanced through her spine. She bit back a cry, sweat already beading on her brow despite the chill that seeped through the stone walls. Thorne was at her side before she could speak, eyes sharp and hands steady. "It's early," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Not by much," he said, guiding her to the low pallet near the hearth. "And not too early to fight for." The pain came in waves, sharp, breathless, unrelenting. The wind howled through the chimney like a scream held back too long. Outside, the storm flooded the village green, but inside, there was only the rhythm of survival. Thorne moved with calm urgency, boiling water, crushing roots, muttering things she couldn't hear. He wiped her forehead, whispered grounding words, and when her hands clutched his sleeve like a lifeline, he didn't flinch. "You've done harder things," he said gently. "You've endured what most couldn't. Now bring this life into the world the same way you walked back into it, head high, breath steady." Hours passed, maybe days. Time blurred between cries and silence, between contractions that split her open and moments of unbearable stillness. And then, suddenly the sound she hadn't dared to imagine filled the cottage, a cry, tiny but fierce, like a secret demanding to be known. Eliza sobbed, not from pain but from disbelief. Thorne placed the child in her arms, his voice hoarse. A girl, strong lungs, quick hands, already trying to grab the world. The baby was red and wrinkled and perfect, her tiny fists flailing as if to stake her claim. Eliza kissed her forehead, tears falling freely. "You're not a curse," she whispered. "You're a beginning." Thorne didn't speak, but he stayed close. tending the fire, watching over them with a guardian stillness. When morning came, golden light filtered through the storm-smeared window, and the village awoke unaware that a new soul had arrived under their noses, not in silk sheets or gilded halls, but on a blanket of herbs and courage. Eliza looked down at her daughter and smiled. She had nothing the world counted valuable, no title, no riches, no name etched in stone. But in her arms, she held everything worth saving. The village healer's cottage, once a place of whispers and suspicion, became a quiet shrine in the days that followed. Women came bearing broth and clean linens, pretending they were just being neighborly, but their eyes lingered too long on the baby in Eliza's arms. "Looks like the Hargrave brow," one of them muttered, but Thorne's presence at the door discouraged anything beyond that. Eliza named her daughter Ivy, not for the nobility who discarded her, but for the way the plant clung to life, curling around ruin and making it beautiful again. "Ivy Rose," she whispered as she wrapped the child in a shawl she'd stitched from scraps, "because you'll bloom where they never thought anything could." Ivy slept soundly beside her mother, often curled into the crook of Eliza's arm or pressed against her chest like she belonged nowhere else. Thorne busied himself with requests from villagers who now came more readily, less hesitant to knock. "I hear she knows fever root now," they'd say, "and her hands are steadier than his." Eliza worked through the aches and sleeplessness, determined to earn her place. She learned how to bind wounds, mix poultices, measure tinctures with precision. When she wasn't caring for Ivy, she was tending to the wounded or delivering salves to cottages she once feared to approach. Even children began to wave when she passed, and though some elders still crossed the street, they no longer muttered prayers against her shadow. But still, her past followed like a hound with its nose in the wind. One morning, while gathering chamomile near the chapel steps, she saw a figure she'd never hoped to see again, Thomas Hargrave, the manor's younger son. The father. He was dressed like a man trying not to be noticed, in a plain coat with the collar turned up, but she'd know that jawline anywhere. He paused when their eyes met, and Eliza felt Ivy stir against her back, slung in a makeshift wrap. He didn't speak. He only looked, first at Eliza, then at the child, and then back again. And then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the alley like smoke. She stood motionless for a long time, heart thudding not with longing, but with strange, cold relief. She had feared he might come for her. Now she knew he wouldn't, and somehow that was better. It meant the story was truly hers now. It began with shouting, a boy sprinting through the village green, hair soaked with sweat and fear. "The blacksmith's roof! It's caught! It's spreading!" Eliza looked up from the herbs she was sorting, Ivy strapped to her chest, and saw smoke curling like a claw above the treetops. Thorne was already moving, grabbing buckets and barking orders as he ran. Without hesitation, Eliza followed, her feet pounding the dirt path as villagers poured from their cottages with pails, wet rags, anything they could carry. The fire had leapt from roof to haystack, licking the wood with greedy hunger, and the wind drove the flames toward the neighboring stables. "We need more water," someone cried. "We need hands!" Eliza passed Ivy into the arms of the baker's wife without a word, and ran straight into the chaos. Heat slapped her face, smoke clawed at her lungs, but she kept moving, hauling water, screaming warnings, helping an old man out before his thatched porch collapsed behind him. Thorne appeared beside her, ash streaked across his cheeks, his voice hoarse from shouting. "We stop it here or we lose half the village," he said, pointing to the final fence line before the fire reached the grain store. Eliza nodded, grabbing a soaked blanket and racing ahead, slapping it across the dry fencing as others joined. They formed a wall, farmers, children, mothers, the same people who had once turned their backs on her, and together they stopped it. The flames hissed and spit but didn't pass. When it was over, Eliza collapsed in the grass, smoke curling above her like the sigh of a beast finally tamed. She was coughing, covered in soot, her dress torn, but alive, and more than that, part of something. The village, once cold and watchful, was suddenly full of eyes that saw her. Not the maid, not the outcast, not the scandal. The woman who ran toward fire. The mother who handed off her child without fear and returned with blistered palms. Ivy cooed in the baker's wife's arms, her tiny fingers tugging at the woman's braid, and when Eliza reached for her, there was no hesitation. "She's lucky," the woman said, handing Ivy over, "to have you." Eliza held her daughter close and looked at the scorched skyline. No longer just a survivor. She was something more. She was home. It arrived at dawn, slipped under the door like a secret that refused to stay buried. Eliza found it while sweeping ash from the hearth, the envelope damp at the edges, but the paper inside untouched. There was no seal, no signature, just her name scrawled in a hand she hadn't seen in months. Thorne watched from the corner of the room as she opened it. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked. "No," she said, her voice quiet but certain. The letter was short, a plea, not a demand. "Eliza, my mother has fallen ill. Father is distant. I've told no one, but I think of you, of her. Let me see the child, once, just once. T.H." She read it twice, then folded it slowly and set it on the table as if it might bite. Thorne didn't speak. He didn't have to. The question hung heavy in the air. "He doesn't want us," she said finally. "He wants peace of mind, a glimpse, so he can walk back into his world and forget we exist." "And if you give him that," Thorne asked, "what do you gain?" Eliza looked down at Ivy, who had just begun to giggle in her sleep. "Nothing," she whispered, "because she's not a regret. She's a reason." The next day she wrote her own letter. No bitterness, no invitation, no apology. Just a single line. "She has my eyes and your silence." That's enough. She left it with the chapel courier and didn't wait for a reply. Days passed, then a week. No word came, but the village shifted again. Where once there had been doubt, there was now quiet respect. The constable nodded when they passed. A widow offered to teach her lacework in the evenings. The schoolteacher asked if she might bring Ivy to the classroom once a week for the children to see. "We've all lost things," the woman said gently. "But you, somehow, you've made something out of loss." Eliza didn't cry. She didn't know how anymore. She simply nodded, kissed Ivy's forehead and said, "She made me too." That night, as Thorne tended to a fevered boy 2 cottages down, Eliza sat by the fire, Ivy curled in her lap, and watched the flames dance. There were no shadows in the room, only warmth, only light, only the sound of her daughter's breathing and the knowledge that she'd chosen to be more than what they tried to make her. Eliza stood beneath the twisted willow outside Thorne's cottage, Ivy in her arms, the spring wind stirring their hair like a lullaby. A full year had passed since she'd been cast out, pregnant, alone, drenched in rain and disgrace. And yet, the woman who now watched the sunrise bore little resemblance to the girl who had once begged at the gates of Hargrave Manor. Behind her, the cottage door creaked open and Thorne stepped out with 2 mugs of tea, his joints slower these days, but his eyes just as sharp. "She's walking soon," he said, nodding at Ivy, who was already trying to squirm from her mother's arms to chase the light on the grass. "She's not walking," Eliza laughed. "She's charging." Thorne smiled, "Like someone else I know." The village had changed, its rhythm, its stories, its loyalties. Eliza's remedies were now requested before Thorne's. Her hands were trusted, her voice respected. People asked her opinion. They offered more than thanks. Eggs, bread, even flowers wrapped in twine. And no one dared call her ruin now. Ivy had become the green heart of the village. Children played at her feet. The blacksmith had carved her a tiny wooden fox. The baker gave her the first crust from every loaf. And Eliza, she had stopped looking over her shoulder. She had stopped waiting for letters or punishment or permission to belong. The past no longer ruled her. It had merely taught her how to rise. That morning, as dew clung to the herbs she'd planted herself, Eliza knelt beside her daughter and touched the soil. "This," she whispered, "is where we start, not where we end." Ivy babbled in reply, scooping up a fistful of earth and offering it with pride. Behind them the village bell rang softly, its chime no longer a summons to judgment, but a call to life. Thorn watched from the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. "You ever think of leaving?" he asked quietly. Eliza stood, brushing soil from her hands, her eyes scanning the hills and stone paths and crooked roofs that had once scorned her. "I did," she said, "but roots grow where you water them, and I think ours are too deep to pull now." She reached for Thorn's hand. Ivy nestled between them, and together they stood at the edge of what once was exile, but was now unquestionably home.